At our 20th anniversary dinner, my husband tapped his glass. "I want a divorce. I found someone younger." He said it loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. I smiled and said, "Perfect timing." I removed my ring, pocketed it, and announced I'd be throwing a Freedom Gala next week. His friends stopped laughing when I shared one tiny detail. "I'm glad to have you here." Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I should have known something was wrong the moment Andre chose Ristorante Bella Corte for our 20th anniversary dinner. In 20 years of marriage, my husband had never once selected an Italian restaurant. He claimed the garlic gave him headaches, and the wine made him drowsy. Yet there we sat, surrounded by warm golden lighting and the rich aroma of basil and oregano, at a table he'd specifically requested near the center of the dining room. The restaurant buzzed with conversation and clinking glasses. Couples leaned across intimate tables while families celebrated around larger ones. Everyone seemed genuinely happy to be there. I smoothed my navy blue dress, the one Andre had complimented when we were dating, and tried to shake the uncomfortable feeling that had been growing in my stomach all week. Andre had been different lately, distant. He'd started working later, claiming new projects at his accounting firm. His phone, which used to sit carelessly on counters and tables, now stayed glued to his side. When it rang during dinner or while we watched television, he'd step into another room to answer. When I asked about it, he'd dismiss my concerns with a wave of his hand. "You're being paranoid, Sylvia," he'd say, not meeting my eyes. "I'm just busy with work." But tonight was supposed to be about us, about celebrating 2 decades together, about remembering why we'd fallen in love when I was 25 and he was 32. I'd even made reservations at the quiet French bistro we'd visited on our first anniversary, but Andre had canceled them without telling me. "I thought we should try somewhere new," he'd said that morning, adjusting his tie in our bedroom mirror. "Somewhere with more atmosphere." The waiter brought our appetizers, bruschetta that Andre hadn't touched and a Caesar salad I was too nervous to eat. My husband kept checking his watch, his leg bouncing under the table in a rhythm that made the silverware tremor slightly. "Are you expecting someone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He looked up sharply, his brown eyes, the same ones that used to make my heart race, now cold and distant. "What makes you say that? You keep looking around the restaurant and checking the time." Andre's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile but felt more like a grimace. "I guess I'm just excited about tonight." The word excited hung in the air between us, heavy with something I couldn't identify. It didn't sound like anticipation for a romantic evening. It sounded like barely contained energy, the kind that comes before doing something you've been planning for a long time. When our entrees arrived, osso buco for him, chicken piccata for me, Andre suddenly straightened in his chair. He reached for his wine glass, a bold Chianti that had stained his lips a deep red, and stood up. The action was so abrupt that several nearby diners turned to look. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the restaurant. The conversations around us began to die down as people realized someone was making an announcement. "I'd like to make a toast." My stomach clenched. Andre was not the type of man who made public speeches. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of person who preferred to blend into the background at social gatherings. In all our years together, I could count on one hand the number of times he'd even raised his voice in our own home. "To my wife, Sylvia," he continued, raising his glass higher. The restaurant had fallen completely silent now, all eyes on our table. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and confusion. "We've been married for 20 wonderful years." The word wonderful dripped with sarcasm that made my skin crawl. Several people in the restaurant began to sense that something was wrong. The elderly couple at the table next to us exchanged worried glances. "But tonight," Andre said, his voice growing stronger, more confident, "I want a divorce." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually gasped, my hand flying to my chest as if I could somehow catch the breath that had been knocked out of me. Around us, the restaurant had become a tomb. Not a single fork clinked against a plate. Not a single glass touched a table. "I've found someone younger," he announced to the room, still holding his wine glass aloft like he was making a victory speech. "Someone who appreciates me. Someone who doesn't spend her days organizing closets and complaining about my work schedule." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what was happening. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from. This was real. My husband of 20 years was divorcing me in front of a room full of strangers, humiliating me in the most public way possible. But even through the shock and pain, something else stirred inside me. Something that surprised me with its clarity and strength. Instead of breaking down, instead of crying or begging or making a scene, I felt an odd sense of calm settle over me. I reached for my own wine glass, my hand steady despite everything that was happening. Standing slowly, I met Andre's eyes across the table. For the first time in months, I saw him clearly, not as the man I'd loved and married, but as a stranger wearing his face. "Perfect timing," I said, my voice carrying just as clearly as his had. The restaurant remained dead silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. I reached for my left hand and slowly, deliberately, slid off my wedding ring. The simple gold band Andre had placed there 20 years ago with shaking hands and tear-filled eyes. The band that had never left my finger through arguments and illnesses, through good times and bad. I held it up so he could see it clearly, then dropped it into my wine glass where it landed with a soft clink. "I'll be throwing a Freedom Gala next week," I announced to the room, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "Consider this your invitation to celebrate my liberation from a marriage that's been dead for longer than I cared to admit." Andre's confident smirk faltered. This clearly wasn't the reaction he'd expected. He'd anticipated tears, pleading, maybe even anger. But not this calm acceptance, not this immediate shift into planning my own celebration. A few people in the restaurant began to murmur approvingly. Someone, I think it was a woman at the bar, actually started to clap. Andre's face began to flush red, but not with confidence anymore, with embarrassment. "You're making a scene, Sylvia," he hissed, finally sitting back down. I smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. "No, Andre, you made the scene. I'm just finishing it." I gathered my purse, leaving my untouched chicken piccata and the ring floating in dark red wine. But before I left, I leaned down close to his ear, close enough that only he could hear what I said next. "You have no idea what you've just set in motion," I whispered, my voice barely audible but steady as granite. "And when you find out, you're going to wish you'd had this conversation privately." As I walked toward the restaurant exit, my heels clicking confidently against the tile floor, I heard Andre call after me. "What's that supposed to mean?" I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see his face to know that for the first time tonight, my husband looked genuinely worried. Because Andre didn't know about the papers hidden in my jewelry box. He didn't know about the phone calls I'd been making while he was at work. And he definitely didn't know about the one secret I'd been keeping that would change everything. But he would soon enough. The cool November air hit my face as I stepped outside, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. 20 years of marriage was ending, but something else was just beginning. Something Andre never saw coming. Something that would make him understand that choosing to humiliate me in public was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. The drive home from Ristorante Bellacorte should have been devastating. I should have been crying, shaking, pulled over on the side of the road somewhere calling my sister or my mother or anyone who might offer comfort. Instead, I felt remarkably clear-headed as I navigated the familiar streets toward our house. The 2-story colonial we'd bought 15 years ago when Andre got promoted to senior accountant. Our house. I had to remind myself that it was still our house, at least for now. Andre's dramatic announcement didn't magically transfer ownership or dissolve 2 decades of shared assets. But as I pulled into the driveway and saw the warm light glowing from our kitchen window, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. I'd been expecting this moment for longer than I cared to admit. The signs had been there for months, maybe even longer. I'd just been too comfortable, too trusting, or maybe too afraid to really see them. It started around March, just 8 months ago. Andre began staying late at the office 3 or 4 nights a week. When I'd pack him dinner to take along, he'd wave me off with irritation. "The vending machines are fine, Sylvia," he'd said, not looking up from his laptop. "I don't need you treating me like a child." The comment had stung, but I'd rationalized it. Tax season was always stressful for him. He was probably just feeling overwhelmed and taking it out on me. It would pass, I told myself. It always had before. But then came the phone calls. At first they were rare, maybe 1 or 2 a week that he'd take in the garage or the basement. When I asked about them, he had ready explanations. "Client emergency," he'd say. "You know how it is." Except I did know how it was, and Andre had never taken client calls at home before. His firm had strict policies about work-life balance, something Andre used to praise about his job. He'd often told me how much he appreciated being able to leave work at work. By June, the calls were coming daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Andre would excuse himself from dinner, from television, from conversations with me to answer calls that apparently couldn't wait until morning. His explanations became more vague. "Work stuff," he'd mumble, already walking away from me. I started paying closer attention. The calls never lasted very long, usually 15 or 20 minutes, but Andre's voice would change when he answered. It became softer, more animated. Sometimes I could hear him laughing from whatever room he'd hidden himself in. One evening in July, I was watering the plants on our back deck when I heard him through the open kitchen window. He was making dinner plans with someone, discussing a restaurant I'd never heard of, talking about meeting next Tuesday after work. When he hung up and came outside, I asked casually, "Work dinner tomorrow?" He looked confused for a moment, then nodded quickly. "Yeah, with Bob from the Peterson account. You remember Bob?" I did remember Bob Peterson. Andre had worked with him for 3 years, and Bob was a 72-year-old grandfather who rarely stayed past 4 o'clock and had never, to my knowledge, suggested dinner meetings. But I didn't challenge Andre's story. Not then. The changes weren't just about the phone calls. Andre started paying more attention to his appearance. He began going to the gym again after a 5-year hiatus, claiming he wanted to get back in shape. He bought new clothes, fitted dress shirts, expensive jeans, cologne that came in sleek black bottles and cost more than we usually spent on groceries in a week. "You look good," I told him one morning as he adjusted his new tie in our bedroom mirror. He barely glanced at me. "Thanks," he said, but there was no warmth in it. It was the kind of response you'd give a stranger who complimented your shirt in an elevator. Our physical relationship changed too, though so gradually I almost didn't notice at first. Andre had never been particularly affectionate, but he'd always been consistent. We'd held hands while watching television, kissed goodbye in the mornings, made love every week or 2 with comfortable familiarity. All of that stopped. Andre began staying up later, claiming he wasn't tired. He'd come to bed long after I'd fallen asleep and wake up before me, showering and dressing quietly in the bathroom so he wouldn't wake me. Except I was already awake. I was lying there listening to the water run, wondering when my husband had become a stranger. The worst part wasn't the distance, though. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I'd catch him studying me sometimes with an expression I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't hatred or anger. It was something colder. Calculation. Like he was measuring something, weighing options. In August, I found a receipt in his pants pocket while doing laundry. Dinner for 2 at Romano's, an upscale steakhouse downtown. $137 for 2 filet mignons, a bottle of wine, and dessert. The date was a Tuesday, the same Tuesday he'd supposedly had a work dinner with Bob Peterson. I stood in our laundry room holding that receipt, my hands shaking slightly. There could be explanations. I told myself. Maybe Bob had expensive taste. Maybe they'd been entertaining a client. Maybe Andre had just forgotten to mention that someone else had joined them. But I knew. In that moment, standing among piles of dirty clothes and the familiar smell of detergent, I knew my husband was having an affair. The smart thing would have been to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation, to insist on honesty, to fight for our marriage. Instead, I folded the receipt neatly and placed it in my jewelry box, underneath the small velvet pouch where I kept my grandmother's pearls. I told myself I needed more information before I could make any decisions. I told myself I had to be sure. But really, I think I was just afraid. Afraid of the conversation that would change everything. Afraid of hearing truths I wasn't ready to face. Afraid that 20 years of my life had been wasted on a man who no longer wanted me. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention without appearing to. I noticed that Andre had stopped talking about his day at dinner. He used to complain about difficult clients or share funny stories about his coworkers. Now he just ate in silence, checking his phone periodically and offering one-word answers to my questions. I noticed that he'd started doing his own laundry, claiming he wanted to be more helpful around the house. Except he'd never shown interest in household chores before, and the clothes he washed separately were always the nice ones, the new shirts and expensive jeans. I noticed that he'd changed his computer password. Our shared laptop, the one we'd both used for years to check email and pay bills, suddenly required a login I didn't know. When I asked about it, Andre claimed there had been a security breach at work and he'd been advised to change all his passwords. "Better safe than sorry," he'd said, not meeting my eyes. September brought new developments. Andre announced that he'd be working some Saturday mornings to help the firm catch up on a backlog of annual reviews. He'd leave the house by 8:30 and return around 2 o'clock, claiming to have spent the morning buried in spreadsheets and tax documents. One Saturday, I drove by his office building. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a security guard's car and a maintenance van. Andre's blue Honda was nowhere to be seen. I sat in my car across the street for nearly an hour, wondering where my husband was spending his Saturday mornings, wondering who he was with, wondering how long this had been going on. Part of me wanted to call him, to ask directly where he was and demand the truth. But a larger part of me wasn't ready for that conversation yet. By October, I realized I was living with someone I no longer recognized. Andre had become a polite stranger who happened to share my address. We moved around each other in our house like roommates who barely got along, speaking only when necessary, existing in parallel lives that rarely intersected. I started making plans without him. I joined a book club at the library, something I'd considered for years but never done because Andre had always seemed mildly dismissive of my reading habits. I began having lunch with old friends I'd lost touch with, women who asked careful questions about how Andre was doing and seemed unsurprised when I gave vague, non-committal answers. And through it all, I kept that receipt in my jewelry box, along with other small pieces of evidence I'd gathered without really planning to. A credit card statement showing charges at restaurants I'd never been to. A dry cleaning receipt for a dress shirt that came back smelling like perfume I didn't recognize. A business card from a florist that fell out of his wallet when he was paying for groceries. I wasn't investigating exactly. I was just aware, paying attention in a way I hadn't before. And everything I noticed confirmed what I already knew, but wasn't ready to admit. My marriage was over, and had been for longer than I cared to calculate. Tonight's dramatic announcement at Ristorante Bella Corte hadn't been a sudden decision. It had been the culmination of months of planning, months of Andre building toward this moment when he could humiliate me publicly and walk away feeling justified. But Andre had made one crucial miscalculation. He assumed I'd been as oblivious as I'd appeared to be. He assumed I'd be devastated, helpless, dependent on his mercy for whatever scraps of dignity and financial security he chose to leave me. He had no idea that while he'd been planning his exit, I'd been making preparations of my own. He had no idea about the letter hidden in my jewelry box, right next to that first receipt from Romano's. The letter that had arrived 6 months ago and changed everything, even though I'd told no one about it. Not even Andre. Especially not Andre. I didn't sleep that night after leaving the restaurant. How could I? 20 years of marriage had ended with a public spectacle that would probably be the talk of the neighborhood for months. But what kept me awake wasn't the humiliation or even the shock of Andre's announcement. It was knowing that I finally had to face the truth I'd been avoiding for 8 months. I needed to know who she was. Andre hadn't come home. I'd heard his car in the driveway around midnight, then the sound of the engine starting again 20 minutes later. He'd probably just come to pack a bag, I realized. He'd likely been planning this for weeks, maybe even had an apartment lined up somewhere. The thought should have hurt more than it did. I spent the dark hours before dawn sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at the small stack of evidence I'd finally pulled from my jewelry box. The receipt from Romano's Steakhouse, the dry cleaning slip that smelled like unfamiliar perfume, the business card from Petals and Stems Florist, and at the bottom of the pile, the letter that had changed everything 6 months ago, even though I'd told no one about it. But first, I needed answers about Andre's mystery woman, the woman he'd chosen over 20 years of marriage. The woman worth humiliating me in front of a restaurant full of strangers. By 7 o'clock that morning, I'd made my decision. I got dressed carefully, not in my usual comfortable clothes, but in the black pantsuit I wore to important occasions. If I was going to confront my husband's lies, I was going to do it looking like the strong woman I'd forgotten I could be. Andre's office was in a glass building downtown, the kind of modern structure that reflected the morning sun and made everything around it look pale by comparison. I'd been there countless times over the years. Christmas parties, company picnics, the occasional lunch when I happened to be in the area. I knew the layout, knew which elevator bank led to the accounting firm on the 14th floor. I also knew Andre's schedule. He always arrived by 8:15 and spent the first 30 minutes of his day reviewing client files with his morning coffee. He was a creature of habit, something that had once comforted me and now worked to my advantage. I waited in the parking garage until I saw his blue Honda pull into his assigned space. I watched him gather his briefcase and coffee mug, the one I'd given him 2 Christmases ago with "World's Best Husband" printed on the side. The irony wasn't lost on me. I gave him 15 minutes to get settled, then took the elevator to the 14th floor. The receptionist, a young woman named Jessica who'd always been friendly to me at company events, looked surprised to see me. "Mrs. Patterson, how nice to see you. Are you here to surprise Andre?" The name hit me like a physical blow, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. Actually, I was hoping to speak with him about something important. "Is he free?" "Let me check." Jessica picked up her phone, but I held up a hand. "Don't call ahead," I said quickly. "I want it to be a surprise." She smiled and nodded toward the hallway. "He's in his usual office. You know the way." I did know the way. I'd walked this path dozens of times before, usually bringing Andre lunch or stopping by after shopping trips downtown. But this time felt different. Each step felt heavier, more final. Andre's office door was partially open, and I could hear him talking quietly on the phone. I paused just outside, not intending to eavesdrop, but unable to help myself. "I know it was hard to watch," he was saying, his voice softer than I'd heard it in months. "But it's over now. She knows, and we don't have to hide anymore." My heart began to pound so hard I was sure it was audible in the hallway. "I love you too," Andre continued. "I should have done this years ago. We both know that." There was a pause, then he laughed. The same warm, genuine laugh I remembered from our early dating days, but hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I could remember. "Of course I'm sure," he said. "Sylvia and I. We've been over for a long time. Last night just made it official. You're the one I want to be with. You're the one I should have chosen from the beginning." I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to my husband declare his love for another woman less than 12 hours after publicly divorcing me. The pain was sharp and immediate, but underneath it was something else. relief, maybe, or validation that my instincts had been right all along. "I have to go," Andre said. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes, but I'll call you later, okay? Maybe we can celebrate properly tonight." I heard the phone click, then the sound of his chair creaking as he leaned back. This was my moment. I could walk away, pretend I'd never heard any of it, and handle the divorce through lawyers like civilized people. Or I could push open that door and demand answers. I pushed open the door. Andre looked up from his desk, his expression shifting from relaxed contentment to shock to something that might have been fear. "Sylvia," he said, half rising from his chair. "What are you doing here?" "I came to talk to my husband," I said, stepping into his office and closing the door behind me. Though I'm starting to wonder if I even know who that is anymore. Andre sat back down slowly, his face flushing red. "If this is about last night..." "It's about a lot of things," I interrupted, "including the phone call you just finished. The one where you told someone you loved them. The one where you said you should have chosen them from the beginning." He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. For a moment, we just stared at each other across his desk. The same desk where he'd worked late so many nights, claiming to be buried in client files and tax returns. "How long?" I asked quietly. "Sylvia, I don't think..." "How long, Andre?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. 2 years, he said finally. Maybe a little longer. 2 years. 2 years of lying, of pretending, of making me feel like I was imagining the distance between us. 2 years of letting me believe that our marriage problems were my fault, that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I wasn't interesting enough to hold his attention. "Who is she?" I asked. Andre hesitated, his eyes darting away from mine. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Another long pause. Then, so quietly, I almost didn't hear him. "Miranda." The name hit me like a punch to the stomach. Miranda. My best friend Miranda. The woman who'd been my maid of honor. The woman who'd held my hand through my father's funeral 3 years ago. The woman I'd called crying when I suspected Andre was having an affair, never imagining. "Miranda Walsh," I whispered. And Andre's flinch confirmed what I already knew. I sank into the chair across from his desk, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. Miranda. Sweet, single Miranda who'd never been married, who'd always claimed she envied what Andre and I had together. Miranda who'd been coming to our house for dinner every few weeks, who'd helped me plan Andre's surprise 40th birthday party last year, who'd listened sympathetically when I'd confided my fears that my marriage was falling apart. "She was supposed to be my friend," I said, more to myself than to him. "She is your friend," Andre said defensively. "She never wanted this to happen. Neither of us did. It just did." I looked up at him, this man I'd shared a bed with for 20 years, and realized I didn't recognize him at all. It just happened? For 2 years? You both just accidentally fell into each other's beds every Tuesday when you were supposedly having work dinners? Andre had the grace to look ashamed, at least. "It started innocently," he said. "She was going through a rough patch with her job, and I was. We were having problems, you and I. We were just friends talking. And then you decided to have an affair instead of talking to your wife about our problems. You wouldn't have listened," he said, his voice rising slightly. "You never listen, Sylvia. You're so focused on your routines, your book clubs, your perfect little organized life that you never noticed I was drowning." The accusation stung, partly because there might have been some truth to it. I had been comfortable in our routine, maybe too comfortable. But that didn't excuse what he'd done. "So you talked to Miranda instead," I said. "At first, yes. Just as friends. But she understood me in a way that you haven't for a long time." I stood up slowly, my purse clutched tightly in my hands. "Where?" "What? Where do you meet her? Because I know it's not at work dinners with Bob Peterson." Andre looked down at his desk. She has an apartment downtown, near the River District. Of course she did. Miranda had moved 6 months ago, claiming she wanted to be closer to her job. She'd invited me over several times to see her new place, but something had always come up. Work or appointments or Andre needing me for something. Now I realized those weren't coincidences. She'd never wanted me to see her apartment because Andre was probably there half the time. "The flowers," I said, remembering the florist's business card. "You buy her flowers." Andre nodded miserably. "How often?" "Sylvia, I don't see how often do you buy my best friend flowers, Andre?" "Every Friday," he whispered. "For the past year." Every Friday, while I was at home making dinner for a husband who was planning to leave me for my best friend. While I was doing his laundry and paying his bills and organizing our life together, he was buying another woman flowers every single week. I turned toward the door, then stopped. "Last night," I said without looking back. "The restaurant. You chose it because you knew she'd be watching, didn't you? You wanted her to see you humiliate me." Silence. "You wanted to make a show of choosing her over me. You wanted everyone to see that I was the pathetic wife being discarded for someone better." "Sylvia!" I turned back to face him one last time. "You made one mistake, Andre. You assumed I'd be destroyed by this. You assumed I'd be left with nothing." I could see confusion in his eyes, and something that might have been worry. "But you don't know everything about me," I continued. "You stopped paying attention to your wife a long time ago, and that's going to cost you more than you realize." I left him sitting at his desk, probably wondering what I meant, probably calling Miranda the moment I was out of sight. Let him wonder. Let him worry. Because while he'd been planning his grand exit, playing house with my former best friend and buying her flowers every Friday with money from our joint account, I'd been dealing with something he knew nothing about. Something that was about to change everything. The drive home from Andre's office was a blur of traffic lights and familiar streets that suddenly felt foreign. Miranda. My best friend Miranda. The woman who'd sat in my kitchen just 3 weeks ago, drinking coffee and listening to me worry about my marriage, offering tissues and sympathy while she was sleeping with my husband. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for several minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel as everything I thought I knew about my life rearranged itself in my mind. 20 years of marriage to a man who'd been lying to me. A friendship I'd treasured for 15 years that had been a sham for the last 2. I should have been devastated. Part of me was. But there was something else, too. Something that had been waiting in my jewelry box for 6 months, hidden beneath my grandmother's pearls, and that first receipt from Romano's Steakhouse. Something that Andre and Miranda knew nothing about. Something that was about to change the balance of power in ways they never could have imagined. Inside the house, I went straight to my bedroom and opened the jewelry box with hands that were steadier than they should have been. There it was, exactly where I'd left it. The cream-colored envelope with the return address of Hartwell, Morrison and Associates, attorneys at law. The letter that had arrived on a Tuesday morning in June while Andre was at work, claiming to have a client emergency. I'd almost thrown it away, assuming it was some kind of sales pitch or scam. Law firms didn't typically contact housewives out of the blue, and I'd never heard of Hartwell, Morrison and Associates. But something about the expensive stationery and the formal way my name was typed on the front had made me curious enough to open it. Now I unfolded the letter again, even though I'd memorized every word over the past 6 months. "Dear Mrs. Sylvia Patterson," it began. "We are writing to inform you that you have been named as the sole beneficiary in the estate of Eleanor Margaret Whitmore, deceased. Ms. Whitmore was your late mother's sister, and according to her will, she has left her entire estate to you, including real property, investments, and liquid assets totaling approximately $800,000. $800,000. When I'd first read those words, I'd had to sit down. I remembered Aunt Eleanor vaguely, my mother's younger sister who'd moved to Colorado when I was a child and had rarely visited. She'd sent Christmas cards sporadically and had attended my mother's funeral 12 years ago, but we'd never been close. I'd honestly forgotten she existed until her lawyer contacted me. The letter went on to explain that Aunt Eleanor had never married or had children, and that she'd been a successful real estate investor who'd built a considerable fortune over her lifetime. She'd apparently followed my life from a distance, keeping track of my marriage and deciding that I should inherit everything when she died of a stroke at 78 years old. Ms. Whitmore left specific instructions that this inheritance was to remain confidential until the recipient chose to reveal it, the letter continued. She believed that sudden wealth could complicate family relationships and wanted you to have time to adjust to your new circumstances privately. Aunt Eleanor had been wise. If I'd announced this inheritance in June, Andre probably would have seen it as joint property in any divorce proceedings. He would have expected to claim half of everything, maybe more. But I'd kept quiet, something telling me to wait, to keep this secret until I understood what it might mean for my future. Over the following months, I'd met with Mr. Hartwell several times, always when Andre was at work. I'd learned that Aunt Eleanor's estate included not just liquid assets, but also 2 rental properties in Denver that generated monthly income. I'd inherited financial independence I'd never dreamed of, security that meant I could survive, even thrive, without Andre's modest accountant salary. I'd also learned something else during those meetings with the lawyer. Mr. Hartwell had asked careful questions about my marriage, about my husband's involvement in our finances, about whether I felt safe and supported at home. At the time, I'd thought his questions were odd, maybe overly personal. Now I realized Aunt Eleanor must have left instructions for him to ask them. Somehow, she'd sensed that her niece might need an escape route. The irony was perfect. While Andre had been planning his exit strategy, buying flowers for another woman, and preparing to humiliate me publicly, I'd been sitting on enough money to disappear entirely if I chose to. While he'd been assuming I'd be left helpless and dependent on whatever scraps he chose to leave me, I'd been quietly meeting with financial advisors and learning about investment portfolios. And the best part? Under Colorado law, inheritances received during marriage were considered separate property, not marital assets. Even if Andre tried to claim half of everything in the divorce, he had no legal right to Aunt Eleanor's money. It was mine, completely and entirely. I picked up my phone and dialed Mr. Hartwell's direct number. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Patterson," he said warmly. "How are you doing?" "I've been better," I admitted, "but I think it's time to make some changes." "I see. Does this have to do with your marriage situation?" I'd mentioned in passing during our last meeting that Andre and I were having some difficulties, though I hadn't gone into detail. "My husband asked me for a divorce last night, very publicly, very humiliatingly." There was a pause. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm not entirely surprised. Eleanor suspected something like this might happen eventually." "What do you mean?" "She left some additional instructions in her will. Instructions I wasn't supposed to share unless you found yourself in exactly this situation." I heard papers rustling. She wrote, "If my niece's marriage ends, she should know that she has more power than she realizes. Help her use it wisely." More power than I realized. I smiled for the first time since leaving Andre's office. "Mr. Hartwell," I said, "I need to know exactly what my options are, and I need to know them today." We spent the next hour on the phone while he explained the full extent of my new financial position. $800,000 was just the beginning. The rental properties in Denver were worth another $300,000 combined, and they generated approximately $4,000 in monthly rental income. Aunt Eleanor had also invested wisely over the years, leaving me a portfolio of stocks and bonds that Mr. Hartwell estimated would continue growing if managed properly. I was, quite suddenly, a millionaire, not a lottery winner rich millionaire, but a comfortable, independent woman who would never have to worry about money again. A woman who could afford the best divorce lawyer in the state if she chose to. A woman who could walk away from her cheating husband and lying best friend without looking back. But I wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. Mr. Hartwell, I said as our conversation was winding down, I want you to prepare some documents for me. What kind of documents? I want to file for divorce first, before Andre has a chance to. And I want to make sure he understands exactly what he's lost by choosing to humiliate me instead of talking to me like an adult. There was approval in the lawyer's voice when he responded. I think Eleanor would be proud of you, Mrs. Patterson. When would you like to get started? Immediately. After I hung up, I walked through my house. The house Andre and I had shared for 15 years, the house he'd just abandoned for an apartment with my former best friend. I looked at the furniture we'd chosen together, the photos on the walls documenting 20 years of a marriage that had apparently been a lie for the last 2 years. I should have felt sad. I should have been crying or raging or calling my sister to sob about the betrayal. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, excitement. Not about the money, though that certainly changed things. Excitement about the possibilities ahead of me. About the life I could build without a husband who took me for granted and a best friend who'd been stabbing me in the back. My phone buzzed. A text from Miranda. Sylvia, honey, I heard about last night. I'm so sorry. Call me if you need anything. I'm here for you. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Let her wonder. Let her worry about whether I suspected anything. Let her spend the next few days pretending to be my supportive friend while sleeping with my soon-to-be ex-husband. She had no idea what was coming. Neither of them did. I went back to my jewelry box and pulled out one more thing. Aunt Eleanor's ring. A simple band with a small sapphire that Mr. Hartwell had delivered along with her letter. I'd never worn it, saving it for some special occasion that had never seemed to arrive. I slipped it onto my right hand now, where it caught the afternoon light streaming through my bedroom window. It felt like a promise, or maybe a reminder. I wasn't the helpless, discarded wife Andre thought he was leaving behind. I was Eleanor Whitmore's niece. I was a woman with resources and options, and for the first time in years, a clear sense of what I wanted to do with my life. And what I wanted to do was make sure Andre and Miranda understood exactly what they'd thrown away when they chose to humiliate me instead of being honest with me. The game was about to change, and this time, I held all the cards. I had exactly 4 days to put my plan into motion before Andre would start wondering why I hadn't fallen apart. 4 days before he and Miranda would expect me to come crawling back, begging for scraps of their mercy and whatever financial support they felt generous enough to provide. They had no idea what was coming. Mr. Hartwell worked quickly. By Thursday afternoon, I had divorce papers filed and ready to be served. By Friday morning, I'd opened new bank accounts and transferred the inheritance funds into accounts that had only my name on them. Andre had always handled our joint finances, assuming I was too scattered or disinterested to pay attention to money matters. That assumption was about to cost him dearly. I spent Friday afternoon at Petals and Stems, the florist whose business card I'd found in Andre's wallet. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Carol, recognized me immediately when I described the weekly flower orders. "Oh yes," she said with a sympathetic smile. "Your husband's been ordering arrangements for his friend every Friday for about a year now. Always roses. Always expensive ones. Usually runs him about $75 to $80 each time. $75 to $80 every week for a year meant Andre had spent nearly $4,000 of our joint money buying flowers for my best friend. $4,000 while he'd been telling me we needed to cut back on our grocery budget. "I'd like to place an order," I told Carol, "for delivery today." "Of course. What would you like to send?" I smiled. "A dozen black roses, with a very specific note." Carol raised an eyebrow but wrote down my instructions without comment. I paid with my new credit card, the one connected to my inheritance account, and gave her Miranda's address, the address Andre had finally admitted to when I'd cornered him in his office. The note I'd written was simple. "For someone who collects other people's husbands, Enjoy your prize. S. By 6 o'clock that evening, my phone was buzzing constantly. First Andre, then Miranda, then Andre again. I let every call go to voicemail, finally turning the phone off entirely. Let them panic. Let them wonder what I knew and what I planned to do about it. I spent Friday night in my house, I reminded myself, since Andre had abandoned it, packing up anything that belonged to him. His clothes, his books, his collection of vintage beer steins that I'd always hated. Everything went into boxes that I stacked neatly by the front door. When he came back for his things, he'd find them waiting like a hotel checkout. Saturday morning brought unexpected visitors. I was having coffee in my kitchen when I heard a car in the driveway, then aggressive knocking on my front door. Through the peephole, I could see Miranda standing on my porch, her usually perfect blonde hair disheveled, her face red and angry. Behind her, looking uncomfortable and slightly ashamed, was Andre. I almost didn't answer. Part of me wanted to let them stand out there knocking, to make them understand that they no longer had any claim on my time or attention. But another part of me was curious. I wanted to see how they'd try to spin this situation, how they'd attempt to make themselves the victims. I opened the door slowly, keeping the chain lock in place. "Sylvia," Miranda said immediately, her voice higher than usual. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I asked calmly. "Because I think everything's been said already. Andre made his feelings quite clear Wednesday night, and you've made your position obvious for the past 2 years." Miranda flinched. Andre stepped forward, his jaw tight with frustration. "You sent her threatening flowers," he said accusingly. "That's harassment, Sylvia. That's not like you." I almost laughed. "You're right, Andre. It's not like me. The old me would have hidden in this house, crying and blaming myself for not being good enough to keep my husband faithful. But the old me didn't know her husband was spending our money on flowers for her best friend every week for a year." Both of them had the grace to look ashamed, at least momentarily. "Let us in," Miranda said, trying to push against the door. "We're not having this conversation on your front porch where the neighbors can hear." "Why not?" "You didn't seem concerned about public scenes when Andre announced our divorce in front of 50 strangers at Ristorante Bellacourt." "That was different," Andre said weakly. "How?" He didn't have an answer for that. I studied both of them through the narrow gap in the doorway. They looked like people who'd been caught in a lie and were scrambling to find a way to make themselves look better. Miranda's designer jeans and expensive handbag suddenly seemed like costumes she was wearing to play a part she didn't deserve. "What do you want?" I asked finally. "We want to explain," Miranda said. "This isn't how we wanted you to find out." "Really? How did you want me to find out? Were you planning to tell me before or after my husband left me for my best friend?" Andre shifted uncomfortably. "Sylvia, you have to understand." "I have to understand what? That you're both liars? That you're both capable of betraying someone who trusted you? I think I understand that perfectly now." "We never meant for it to happen this way," Miranda said, and I could see tears in her eyes. Real tears, which somehow made me angrier than if she'd been faking them. "How did you mean for it to happen, Miranda? Did you have a plan for this? A timeline?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Andre put a protective hand on her shoulder, and something about the gesture, the casual intimacy of it, the way he touched her like she belonged to him, made my chest tight with rage. "You know what?" I said, starting to close the door. "I don't actually care how you meant for it to happen. It happened. You chose each other over honesty, over friendship, over 20 years of marriage. Now live with that choice." "Wait," Andre said desperately, putting his foot in the door. "We need to talk about the practical stuff, the house, our accounts, the divorce settlement." There it was, the real reason for their visit. They weren't here to apologize or explain. They were here to make sure they got what they thought they deserved from the wreckage of our marriage. "Our accounts?" I repeated slowly. "Our joint accounts," Andre clarified. I know you're angry, but we need to be adults about dividing our assets fairly. I stared at him for a long moment. Adults? I said. You want us to be adults? Yes. The way adults communicate honestly with their spouses instead of lying for 2 years? Andre's face flushed red. That's not fair, Sylvia. Our marriage was over long before Miranda and I. Our marriage was over the moment you decided to lie to me instead of talking to me, I interrupted. But you're right about one thing. We do need to handle this like adults. I reached into the small table by my front door and pulled out a manila envelope, the one Mr. Hartwell had delivered yesterday afternoon. Divorce papers, I said, sliding them through the crack in the door. You've been served. Andre's face went white as he took the envelope. You filed already? Yesterday morning. I would have done it Wednesday night, but the courthouse was closed. But we haven't talked about terms, Miranda said, looking between Andre and the papers. You can't just decide everything unilaterally. I smiled, and I could see my expression unsettled both of them. Actually, Miranda, I can. You see, when a marriage ends because one spouse has been unfaithful, the innocent party tends to get more favorable terms, especially when the unfaithful spouse has been spending marital assets on his affair. Andre's grip on the envelope tightened. What are you talking about? $4,000 in flowers, Andre. Dinner receipts I found going back 18 months. Hotel charges on our credit card for nights when you claim to be working late. Our lawyer is very interested in all the evidence I've been collecting. Our lawyer? Miranda asked. My lawyer, I corrected. James Patterson from Patterson, Wells and Associates. You might have heard of him. He handled the Morrison divorce last year. Mrs. Morrison walked away with 70% of their assets after proving her husband's infidelity. Andre was staring at the papers in his hands like they were written in a foreign language. Sylvia, you can't be serious. We can work this out between ourselves. We don't need expensive lawyers getting involved. We needed honest communication, Andre. We needed you to be faithful to your marriage vows. We needed a lot of things that we're not going to get. So yes, we need lawyers now. I started to close the door again, but Miranda called out desperately. Sylvia, please. I know you hate me right now, but we've been friends for 15 years. That has to count for something. I paused, looking at this woman who'd sat in my kitchen, who'd helped me plan parties, who'd held my hand through my father's funeral while she was sleeping with my husband. You're right, I said finally. 15 years should count for something. It should have counted enough to keep you from betraying me. But it didn't. So now those 15 years count for exactly nothing. I closed the door and locked it, then walked back to my kitchen where my coffee was getting cold. Through the window, I could see them standing on my front porch, Andre reading through the divorce papers while Miranda paced back and forth, gesturing angrily. My phone, which I'd turned back on that morning, started buzzing immediately. Text after text, call after call. I ignored them all. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to negotiate. They'd made their choices, and now they'd live with the consequences. What they didn't know yet, what they wouldn't find out until the divorce proceedings were well underway, was that I no longer needed their money or their support. I no longer needed to fight for half of Andre's modest accountant's salary or a share of our joint savings account that contained less than $20,000. I had my own money now. More money than Andre would see in a lifetime of processing tax returns. And the best part was, none of it was marital property. None of it was subject to division in our divorce. I was about to become a very wealthy single woman, and Andre was about to discover that the wife he'd taken for granted for 20 years had been far more valuable than he'd ever realized. But first, I had one more surprise for them. One final move that would make sure they understood exactly what they'd lost when they chose betrayal over honesty. The game was almost over, and I was about to play my winning hand. The divorce proceedings moved faster than Andre had expected. Mr. Patterson, no relation to Andre, which seemed like poetic justice, was everything Andre's overpriced lawyer wasn't: prepared, ruthless, and armed with evidence that made Andre's infidelity impossible to deny. The flower receipts alone painted a devastating picture. $75 to $80 every Friday for 52 weeks added up to nearly $4,000 of marital funds spent on another woman. But that was just the beginning. Mr. Patterson had hired a private investigator who uncovered hotel receipts, restaurant charges, even a weekend trip to Napa Valley that Andre had claimed was a work conference. Your client spent approximately $18,000 of marital funds on his extramarital affair over the past 2 years, Mr. Patterson informed Andre's lawyer during our first settlement meeting. Mrs. Patterson is seeking full reimbursement of those funds, plus damages for emotional distress. Andre's lawyer, a nervous young man who kept adjusting his glasses, shuffled through his papers uncomfortably. My client disputes some of these charges. Some of these dinners could have been legitimate business expenses. At Romano's Steakhouse? Mr. Patterson raised an eyebrow. With a woman who isn't employed by his firm? On nights when his wife believed he was working late at the office? The room fell silent except for the sound of Andre shifting in his seat. Across the conference table, he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Gone was the confident man who'd made his dramatic announcement at Ristorante Bella Corte. In his place sat someone who was beginning to realize that his carefully planned exit wasn't going to be as clean as he'd hoped. Furthermore, Mr. Patterson continued, Mrs. Patterson is seeking spousal support in the amount of $3,000 per month for the next 5 years, given that she sacrificed career advancement to support her husband's career throughout their 20-year marriage. Andre's lawyer nearly dropped his pen. $3,000? My client only makes $60,000 a year before taxes. That's completely unreasonable. I watched Andre's face as the numbers sank in. $3,000 a month would leave him with barely enough to cover his own basic expenses, especially if he was planning to maintain an apartment with Miranda. The comfortable life he'd imagined with his younger girlfriend was evaporating before his eyes. Perhaps your client should have considered the financial implications before engaging in a 2-year affair, Mr. Patterson said coolly. Adultery has consequences, gentlemen. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, Andre looked like he'd aged 10 years. His lawyer was promising to review our demands and respond within a week, but we all knew they had very little room to negotiate. The evidence was overwhelming, and Colorado law wasn't particularly sympathetic to cheating spouses. As we gathered our papers to leave, Andre caught my eye across the table. Sylvia, he said quietly, can we talk privately for a minute? Mr. Patterson started to object, but I held up a hand. 5 minutes, I said. That's all. When the lawyers left the conference room, Andre slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. This isn't what I wanted, he said, not meeting my eyes. I never wanted to hurt you financially. I studied his face, looking for any sign of the man I'd fallen in love with 25 years ago. What did you want, Andre? I wanted to be happy. I wanted to be with someone who made me feel alive again. And you couldn't talk to your wife about feeling dead in our marriage? He finally looked up at me. Would you have listened? The question caught me off guard, because there might have been some truth to it. Had I been so comfortable in our routine that I'd stopped seeing him as a person with needs and desires? Had I been so focused on maintaining our organized, peaceful life that I'd ignored the fact that he was suffocating in it? I don't know, I admitted. But we'll never know now, will we? Because you chose to lie instead of trying. Andre rubbed his temples. $3,000 a month, Sylvia. That will destroy me. You destroyed our marriage, I replied. You destroyed 20 years of trust. You destroyed my friendship with Miranda. So, yes, Andre, there are consequences. Can't we work something out? Something more reasonable? I stood up, gathering my purse. Mr. Patterson will be in touch with your lawyer. Sylvia, wait. Andre stood too, desperation creeping into his voice. "I know you hate me right now, but you can't want to see me homeless. You can't want to destroy my entire life over this." I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. Part of me, a small part, felt sorry for him. This man who'd been my husband for 20 years, who'd held my hand through my mother's funeral, who'd once brought me soup when I had the flu and stayed home from work to take care of me. But that part of me was much smaller now than the part that remembered his smirk at Ristorante Bella Corte. The part that remembered him buying flowers for another woman every Friday while I made dinner for a marriage that was already over. The part that remembered Miranda's tears on my front porch, tears not of genuine remorse, but of frustration at being caught. "You're not homeless, Andre," I said finally. "You have Miranda. You chose her over me, remember? Now you get to live with that choice." The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Andre agreed to all our terms rather than face a lengthy court battle he couldn't afford. I received the house, 3/4 of our joint assets, and yes, $3,000 a month in spousal support for 5 years. What Andre never found out, what the lawyers never needed to know, was that I didn't need his money. Every month when that spousal support payment arrived, I donated it to the local women's shelter. The money he was struggling to send me went to help women who actually needed it, women who were escaping marriages far worse than mine had been. The irony was perfect. Andre was working overtime and living in a cramped studio apartment to send money to women he'd never meet, women whose lives were being rebuilt with his forced generosity. Miranda, I learned through mutual acquaintances, was struggling with the reality of her prize. Dating a married man who bought you flowers and took you to expensive dinners was apparently very different from living with a divorced man who could barely afford rent. She'd moved out of her downtown apartment, the one Andre could no longer help her afford, and was living with a roommate for the first time since college. I learned all this from Sarah, a woman from my book club who ran into Miranda at the grocery store. Sarah, who'd always been more of an acquaintance than a close friend, had become one of my strongest supporters since the divorce. "She asked about you," Sarah told me over coffee at our favorite cafe. "She wanted to know how you were doing, if you were dating anyone, if you seemed happy." "What did you tell her?" Sarah smiled wickedly. "I told her you looked absolutely radiant. Which you do, by the way. I've never seen you happier." And it was true. 6 months after my divorce was finalized, I felt better than I had in years. I'd started traveling, something Andre had always claimed we couldn't afford. I'd taken a photography class and discovered I had an eye for landscapes. I'd joined a hiking group and was in better shape at 65 than I'd been at 40. I'd also quietly started dating. Nothing serious, just coffee dates and dinner with interesting men I'd met through my various new activities. Men who didn't know about my inheritance, who liked me for my conversation and my sense of humor rather than what I could provide for them. The money from Aunt Eleanor sat mostly untouched in carefully managed investment accounts, growing quietly under Mr. Hartwell's guidance. I lived comfortably off the rental income from the Denver properties, $4,000 a month that covered all my expenses and then some. I'd never lived so well while worrying so little about money. But the best part of my new life wasn't the financial freedom. It was the emotional freedom. I woke up every morning in a house that was entirely mine, surrounded by things I'd chosen because I liked them, not because they fit some compromise with a husband's preferences. I made plans that didn't require checking with anyone else. I ate what I wanted for dinner, watched what I wanted on television, went to bed when I was tired instead of when someone else's schedule dictated. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. For the first time in decades, I was myself. A year after the divorce, I ran into Andre at the grocery store. He looked tired, older, his once careful grooming slightly shabby around the edges. He was buying generic brand everything, his cart a study in cost-cutting measures. "Sylvia," he said when he spotted me in the produce section. His voice held a note of surprise, maybe even nervousness. "Andre." I kept my tone neutral, polite. We were strangers now, former spouses who'd moved on with their lives. "You look," he started, then seemed to struggle for words. "You look really good." I was wearing a new dress I'd bought for a photography exhibition opening. My hair cut in a style that was shorter and more flattering than I'd worn during our marriage. I felt confident, attractive, alive. "Thank you," I said simply. An awkward silence stretched between us while other shoppers moved around us. Finally, Andre cleared his throat. "How are you managing?" he asked. "I mean, financially. I know the spousal support isn't much, and with the economy." I almost laughed. He still thought I was struggling, still imagined me counting pennies and worrying about bills. He had no idea that I'd just returned from a 2-week trip to Italy, or that I was considering buying a second home in the mountains. "I'm doing well," I said. "Very well, actually." Something in my tone must have puzzled him, because he frowned slightly. That's good. I'm glad to hear it." Another silence. Then, because I was curious, "How are you and Miranda?" His face fell slightly. We're working things out. It's been an adjustment." An adjustment? That was one way to describe discovering that the affair that seemed so exciting and romantic became much less appealing when it turned into paying bills and doing laundry and dealing with everyday life in a studio apartment. "I hope you're both happy," I said, and meant it. Not because I wished them well exactly, but because their happiness or misery was no longer my concern. "Sylvia," Andre said as I started to move away, "I want you to know I'm sorry for how everything happened, for how I handled things." I stopped and looked at him one last time. This man who'd shared 20 years of my life, who'd known my body and my habits and my fears, who'd become a stranger the moment he chose someone else over honesty. "I know," I said. "But Andre, you're apologizing to the wrong person." "What do you mean?" "You should apologize to yourself. You're the one who lost the most in this." I left him standing there looking confused, probably wondering what I meant. But I knew something Andre didn't understand yet, something that might take him years to figure out. He hadn't just lost a wife when he chose Miranda. He'd lost a partner who would have stood by him through anything if he'd been honest with her. He'd lost someone who would have worked with him to rebuild their marriage if he'd been brave enough to try. He'd lost 20 years of shared history and trust for a relationship built on lies and betrayal. Miranda would leave him eventually, maybe in another year, maybe in 5, but she'd leave. Because relationships that begin with deception rarely end with loyalty. And when that happened, Andre would be alone with the knowledge that he'd thrown away something real for something that was never meant to last. But that was his journey to make, his lessons to learn. I walked to my car in the late afternoon sunshine, my grocery bags full of ingredients for the dinner party I was hosting that weekend. 8 new friends coming to my house to eat food I'd chosen, to drink wine I'd selected, to enjoy each other's company in the home I'd made entirely my own. 26 months ago, I'd been a wife who'd lost herself in someone else's life. Tonight, I was a woman who'd found herself again, stronger and more independent than I'd ever imagined possible. Aunt Eleanor would have been proud. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.